I'm Janet Wolfe, and I have the gift of talking with Dr. Patrick Reyes today, who is a longtime friend, co-conspirator, who is a storyteller and a dream catcher, a writer, an organizer, and soon to be the brand new dean of Auburn Seminary. Thanks so much for taking time to talk with us today.
Thanks for having me.
The question is, if we're standing in the street and we're talking with folks like Ashley and Slam, and they ask you, what's your definition of decolonization? You would say,
oh, for me, it's healing from the erasure and eradication of my people from the record. So healing from this means taking serious that I have lineages of people who have traditions, practices, knowledges, wisdoms that have been erased and eradicated by the powers that be. And part of my work is to decolonize that, is to recapture, reclaim, heal, reimagine what that work looks like for today. So that way they're not erased or eradicated.
So where do you see that happening in your life, in your work, in your community? What's it like when it shows up?
Yeah, the easiest way is I love to say that, as you know, I said between 5 generations of Carmelitas, 5 generations back, there's Carmelita. My grandmother's name was Carmelita. My daughter's Carmelita, and 5 generations, they'll be Carmelita. And the way it shows up pragmatically, decolonization works, is that my grandmother, who was brilliant in her neighborhood, you know, held a lot of practices and traditions and people together. But her family histories, those knowledges, those wisdom she kept in her body that got me to where I am today. What it looks like is writing that down or telling stories on moments like this to say, Grandma Carmelita matters, that great-great-grandmother Carmelita, who had no idea that a little Patrick would be in the world. And in 5 generations, that Carmelita, who has yet to walk it, will know the power of our people and our tradition. So for me as a scholar, it really is about, you know, capturing, doing my best to capture that and recapture and reclaim it as part of what we should all know, not just what my people should know, but what we should all know.
How would you see that connecting with Dr. King's call for a radical revolution of values? This naming of the 3 triplets, the giant triplets of evil, materialism, militarism, and racism. You know, that's part of our focus has been on this April 4th, 67 letter. And it seems to me that in your work, I hear echoes of that, but make it concrete for us.
Yeah, concrete for me is kind of trying to help the folks that I get to work with think about that intergenerationally or ancestrally, that when King was writing and talking about that, of course, it had very pragmatic moment. Like, this is what's happening right now in this moment in history. People are dying in the street. They're hurting from these systems. And those, the triple evils you just named, still exist today. Yeah. So for me, it's about lifting up, how do we make policy change? Or in my case, again, as working with scholars or doing scholarship and trying to do this, how do we rewrite what we need to know? So that way my grandmother, who didn't have a high school diploma, is taught in every single university out there, because what she had to teach is, and this is part of that multi-generational healing, that in order for us to do this work well, in order for us to really treat these things, we have to see them outside of just our own, just this moment. And that's really hard to do when people are suffering and screaming and crying and dying in the streets. For me, is to say, to pay attention to it, be the healer in that moment, using those tools and the capacities that my grandmother taught me, and at the same time, having those moments to kind of zoom back and say, what does it look like I live in the Southwest, we're running out of water, very pragmatically, like the systems, the powers that be have, big industry and the government have wiped this space completely clean. We've erased or eradicated people through genocide, indigenous folks from my wife's family, my own family, in this space. So what does it mean to reimagine in 5 generations what a healed world looks like? That means we really have to think about, this is multi-generational imagination around what does it mean to bring the water back, to reclaim the land, to tell new stories on this about what we're trying to set up in 5 generations, which is more than just like last summer. I mean, it was a legit concern with all the fires and all that. We need to get truckfuls of water here, because people will not, they didn't have enough clean water. And at the same time, this should never happen again. We can't do this year to year. We have to reimagine how we think about the water table here because the rivers have dried up. And for me, that is multi-generational work.
And I think that fits in. I was meeting with some young organizers last night, and I asked them, what do you want to know about decolonization? And one of them said, what are the concrete tools that have not been used by colonizers that we can use to move in new directions, to have new ways of being? Or as you say in one of your books, the purpose gap, to build a new world,
That's
world right, without the colonization and domination.
It's a great question. I think one of the things that I'm blessed with a family that's multicultural, multi-religious. I mean, we check all the boxes on the census together. And part of what at least my approach to decolonization, I'm not a purist. I'm not a decolonizing purist. We're going to get back to some pure state. I don't believe that there is ever such a pure thing that there is such thing as a clean dollar. There's not. Mm-hmm. So for me, if I'm not working from a pure space, I'm working from this broken world that we all are inhabiting together. There isn't a pure tool that will take us to that next thing. In fact, if you're looking for that pure tool, you're doomed to fail. So what we're trying to do is really say, what are the tools, capacities, and coalitions that we need to build across different communities and traditions for us to reimagine that world? So, a concrete example of this would be when folks were back home, some elders had passed away. These are folks who, in where I grew up in Salinas, California, which is an agricultural space, which I write a lot about, the people I went to high school with, that it's not just the folks who work the fields, also folks who own the fields. And one of the kids I went to school with is the owner. I mean, he represents the worst of colonization in both his body and his history. He's not a nice guy. I mean, I've known him for a really long time, but he called me up knowing I'm the religious folk, asking me to do some work with him around the loss of his family members, elder family members. And part of the work then is to imagine what is it that I uniquely bring that can help reshape, so that way his descendants don't damage my descendants in this moment where we're uniquely put together in a conversation where he is deeply vulnerable. How do we do this? And part of that is taking him through ritual and tradition, inviting him into a practice. And when I'm working on the front lines with folks who are in direct opposition to these systems, who are not, kind of butted up against the powers that be, that are really trying to change them, protesting, that sort of thing, that sense of healing, touch is still needed. Mm-hmm. People are broken, they're dying. And so for me, it really has been about, how do we offer the best of these gifts that my grandmother taught me? That's just the gifts of presence and love and some sacred traditions that I think would be helpful for the rest of the world. And I think for young organizers, doing a deep dive, looking for those traditions that are unique to you. And in those cases where you can't find that pure thing, reimagine what that might be.
One of the young organizers was saying, my people are the colonizers. I mean, if you're going back to roots, those are my roots. So if I get rid of that, what do I got left?
That's right.
How do we not only decolonize systems, but folks' souls?
100%.
And how do we do that work?
We wouldn't be the first to ask or answer that question, even in the written stuff. I mean, Memi wrote about, the colonizer and the colonized, famous book where he's wrestling with that dichotomy. We're both and. There is no such thing as a pure. David Truer's work, I think, is fantastic around this and the indigenous kind of worldview that, conflict has been around since the beginning of time. This is not a new thing. What we're living into is the set of conditions we were born into. So what are we going to do in this moment to be different? And I do think that is going to require a level of creativity for this generation to say, what are the things we can recover, reclaim, reimagine for a future self, knowing that that's still not going to be a perfect thing, but that's our task. Yeah.
That fits in. One of the young organizers was saying, aren't we all colonizers? I mean, if we live in this country, in this culture, in these systems, aren't we all participating in the perpetuation of colonization?
Yeah.
And I was struck by, in your first book, Nobody Cries When We Die, you talk about they slay us in the classroom as quickly as we are slain on our streets. How do we begin to unmask our colonial thinking, to undo the very way we interpret the world around us or think about things that come towards us? How do we begin that work? What keeps us on that path?
When I was organizing with Interfaith Worker Justice, I got I had a great opportunity. One of my co-organizers was the principal organizer for Howard Zinn's final lecture. So we got to spend a little bit of time with someone like Howard Zinn, thinking about what do we do with history. And the example that I always love, some of that he gave in that final lecture was that every war is a war on children was kind of his mantra. Like every war, regardless of who's right or wrong or why we're fighting it, does damage, does some trauma to that next generation who has to carry the memory of the loss of their family members. And what does that mean to try to re-heal and reimagine that? And I think about my own sort of unmasking of what I had to unlearn. I think about the way that we teach history, the way we tell our communal storytelling in this country that, manifest destiny, that, U.S. moved from the East Coast to the West. Well, my people have been out here for a really long time. Like it wasn't empty. We were here. And I think about even when we tell our own story around, there's a great book called The Fifth Son that writes about when the Spanish arrive, how the story we're told in school is that, Montezuma, who's sitting there seeing these and interpreting these white colonial settlers coming in as gods, and that all the people just kind of said, oh, yeah, of course this is coming. And the historical record does not support that. Instead, it shows that some of the people in my own lineage actually took up arms. They didn't see that. It was a bunch of folks who were trying to make a political or a survival move to say, how are we going to survive these folks who have weapons that can kill us, that are giving us disease? How do we navigate this politically and socially and actually strategize around this? It wasn't just they're gods. I'm not the descendant of people who didn't know the difference of their traditions and what these humans are as gods. I actually am descendants of warriors, people who saw this moment and were trying to navigate it so that way I could live, so that future Patrick could be in existence. And I think undoing those types of myths and telling new stories or stories that have been erased or not told correctly, that's the work that we can do. I think it heals for future generations.
I was thinking about in your book on the purpose gap, you talk a lot about world building tools. And one of the young organizers last night was asking, what's the connection between reparations and decolonization? Are they linked together? Are they a separate process? Is that a part of building a new world? If so, how's it play out?
Yeah, it's a great question.
The stolen land and the stolen people, and reparations are owed, but what does that look like and what does it mean?
That's absolutely right. I mean, I think those, they're not the same. Let me just say that. They're completely different mechanisms, thoughts, theories that kind of undergird them, and different historical places in which they arise. But I would say that those are tools that we should be thinking about collectively as we build coalitions across different. So when I'm thinking about decolonization is one tool, but it's not the tool that's going to get us to freedom or liberation. It's one of those many mechanisms that has been helpful for us to undo the way that we've thought about colonization. There's this concept in decolonial theory called coloniality, which is this idea that even though colonization, like the formal period of colonization, may be over, which is not in this world, but just imagine a world where it might be over, that the remnants of colonization still exist. Coca-Cola might still exist. The way that we exploit the land, if I'm thinking about where I came from, the agricultural land, and abuse it for monocultures, these kind of markers of colonization are still going to be with us. And we have to reimagine. Decolonization means, if there's, like out here in the Southwest, there used to be 23 different varieties of corn. Now we only do 3.
Yeah.
And most people only think about the ones that come in the bag, the red, blue, and yellow corn, maybe white corn, maybe we get 4 in there. But if we think about how do we redo this work, how do we reimagine it, decolonization is one way that we might get there. Reparations is, tied to a very historical marker in the United States around slavery, enslaved humans. And how do we think about doing that work well in ways that this country, in particular, lawmakers and industry doesn't want to pay, doesn't want to account for stolen lives. And I think
I'm in Tennessee. At least you're in New Mexico.
That's right. And these things need to go side by side. And yeah.
So in the purpose gap, you were talking about not a single day goes by in which whiteness, patriarchy, and colonization do not affect my life. How do you survive that? What keeps you hopeful in the daily onslaught?
Yeah.
Salt.
You know, it's that's also like an admission. It's not just that it happens to me, that I see it happening through me. When I see ways in which my own formation in this American education system and my own family structures and all this stuff where patriarchy or colonization makes me my worst self, you know, where I'm, you know, pushing for work, you know, like work becomes primary, and I see the brokenness on my kids' faces when they're looking at me and they just want to spend some time with me. And I'm like, I gotta bust out this last email, or this issue's really come up over you. Like that's the disease of these systems kind of manifesting themselves in me. So that quote's both an admission of my own guilt, you know, in the ways that it affects me, but also just to say that, you know, when I see Amazon delivery truck in my neighborhood, when I read another report that there's no more water in the river, that these are things I'm participating in because I'm not actively engaged in the work to reimagine how we might build local economies that imagine that. So part of that survival is, you know, the kind of not trying to go numb to it, not just turn on another video game or TV and, you know, binge watching something to forget it, but actually thinking about, well, this moment that we're in right now, the season we're in, the butterflies are starting to migrate here, and that's a representation of our ancestors. So what does it mean to take my kids out into our backyard and make sure we tend to the butterfly garden so that way our ancestors who are coming to visit us have a place to land and nourish themselves before they continue on in their journey? That's life-giving work. That's the type of how I might heal from or survive all those things, is by finding beauty and joy in the work that actually repairs the world, or the world I want to see. So that's how I do it. I mean,
yeah, no, you do a good job of that. I mean, yeah, I think of you as splattering joy wherever you go.
I do my best.
I think you do a good job. One of the things you were saying earlier was the complexity of folks seeing this in ourselves and seeing it in other people, and then also being around folks who are clearly like the powerful colonizers. And you may know Loretta Ross, who's one of our elders on the National Council of Elders. She often talks about the danger of the calling out cancel culture and the urgency of calling in communities, calling in folks. What does that look like when we're talking about colonizing? So you had one specific example of a man who's experiencing grief, and you connect on that, but in an ongoing way, because so much harm has been done, because the grief is so deep, because the sorrow is so loud. How do we open ourselves to different possibilities for connecting with folks? We're dramatically different.
Mine has been around how people find meaning and purpose. So I do a lot of work in education and education systems. And I was consulting with a district out in California just a couple months ago. And one of the most offensive questions I've ever received on any call came out. And it was just like blurted out, like without any sort of filter. And it's clearly coming from a place of woundedness, but it was something along the lines of students of color who are in our district and in our classrooms are not as smart as the white kids in our thing, you know, like, and I don't know what to do because they're clearly not ready for the grade levels that they're in and all this, you know, stuff. Right. So I have this moment where like every piece of my body, I stop breathing. I know on the call, my face turned red, like I'm checking in with myself and just trying to take a moment to say like, okay, this is definitely a call out moment. I could definitely use this moment to say, the hell are you talking about? Like,
Right.
do you know how much we're surviving? Like, we got levels of intelligence you haven't even scratched at or even know to look for. I could totally do that. Instead, what I did was sit with it for just a second, try to remind myself to breathe. And then I called that same person or invited that person in to ask, why are you doing education? Like, why are you here? What is it that you really want accomplished? Because what I heard was that you just want white kids in your class because you want to work with, all that stuff. But my sense is that you got into this, most educators get into this because they want to help people learn, at all levels. And that's still your aim, I'm hoping. And went through this whole like very public conversation where, they had a lot of power in this district to kind of help them think and see through that their vocation really was about activating all students, not just the ones that they felt. And it wasn't actually factually what they were saying was not true. So, having a moment to be able to make space for them to hear that, but also to call them back into why they came to education. Why did you get into this work? And I think a lot of folks who are at the helm of so many big systems, whether it's education system, healthcare system, food, whatever system we're talking about, if you invite them in to think critically about why they're there, what's your main purpose? What is it that you want to do? There's only a handful of really, truly evil people in the world. I think the rest of the folks are trying to manage what they've been given and a mandate that's probably been malformed by the very system that's damaging the rest of us.
Yeah. No, yeah, I think that's exactly right. I had a really good question in my mind and it just flew out somewhere else. Oh, I was going to ask about the role of music, art, stories in both healing and this world building, in reimagining, and what you think, particularly white European folks in this country might learn from the art, the stories, the music, the dance, the potlucks, the traditions. But then where does that hit a line of, like there's a lot of white folks who have gone into restorative justice and it really just looks ugly. It becomes one more form of white supremacy, while the whole time saying, oh, we're doing this ancient tradition from indigenous people. Or folks who take a tiny piece of a culture tradition and say, ta-da, now I am embodying whatever I've just stolen from another culture. So where's the line about learning from and with and taking, stealing, pretending as if you have been shaped by, when really all you're doing is pulling the thread? That's kind of a scattered question, but I bet you know what I'm talking about.
It's a great question. I think part of it for me is honoring, I don't know what it is, the colonial mindset that I can sit in, circle, or I can be with folks from a different culture. And the colonial mindset is what I just experienced, I can take elsewhere as my story or as part of what I've learned. I think about it in terms of like artifacts. It is, I got indigenous art all around me because that's my family. It's where we're from. It's got representation of all this. This artifact right behind me is made by some indigenous weavers in Mexico, and buying the art craft, by supporting their livelihood, by participating, getting to know those artists. That's an important part of building community and honoring their tradition. If I came on this call and said, look, we're all going to make some indigenous textiles together from these conversations I had, and you're going to pay me to train you on how to do this because I want this. That's part of the thing. Like it's that like sense of honoring someone else's tradition, valuing them enough to say, hey, I say this as a joke, but anyone who's gone through education in the United States, you go through K through 12 in a public school or even a private school, you're learning a white Western history. You go to grad school, you're learning a white Western way of being. And if you're doing a PhD, you're learning a white Western way of thinking and propagating that. And if I have to go into education debt to near six figures if you're a student of color, if you're going through all those layers, why can't white folks go into that much debt to learn from my people? I think like there's a value exchange here that's just not being made, that is part of that colonial mindset that I can go and appropriate for free from people of color because their sacred knowledge isn't worth the same dollars and cents that mine is. And that to me is just, it's bargaining in bad faith. It's old school United States treaties. It's just another expression of that sort of thing. Like, I'm going to devalue what you're doing because what matters is actually how I'm interpreting and seeing the world. And so I just invite people in to think about that. Like, how are you really building partnerships and communities with folks who do the work? How are you honoring their work? How are you supporting their work to do that even better, or to share it with the next generation, and teaching your people to do the same, to honor that as well?
I know you have to go in a minute, but another quick question. The power of art just keeps coming back for me in movements, in making change. And I remember when the United States won the Nicaragua election with Violeta Chamorro, one of the first things that they did was to erase all the incredible murals on the walls and to change the traditions in the country, to ask different kinds of questions. How is it that so many people in this country don't value the power of art, of stories, of music that can fuel movements to bring systemic change? What do we do to pull that back in? And maybe you disagree. I mean, maybe you think that people already do, but it feels to me, having been through the civil rights movement in which that was so central, and having seen it in South Africa and Nicaragua, in which art, music, poetry, the way we talk to people changed dramatically and then fueled the movement, is somehow sidelined at the moment, or at least not as visible.
That's a good question. One of the things I'm wrestling with is maybe where the movement space is. I know from a lot of the cultural work that I do, music, art is central to, the way culture is passed on, the way that we do our work. I think on a kind of a national movement, in the way tied to your last question, that certain movements, this is not all movements and definitely not all organizations, have adopted a corporatization of management, of how they think about change happens, the way that it's not led by indigenous elders. And I mean that in the broadest way possible, not just indigenous folks in the US, but like people who are indigenous to their own cultures and traditions and practitioners. And I think also kind of like the middle-class movements aren't working class movements. I cut my teeth in workers movements with folks who were struggling to make ends meet day to day. So when I go back to 1968 and Chavez is marching in the Central Valley where my family's from, up and down Delano, and breaks his fast, it doesn't break it with like McDonald's. he breaks it with communion, with the Roman Catholic Church, with the image of the Guadalupe behind him. So part of it is this sort of like deeper in that deeper cultural work has just been devalued on kind of a national level, and folks who have found comfortable livings within, quote unquote movement spaces aren't in it because of that deeper soul work that needs to happen. That we're really, in my where I grew up in Salinas, California, there's the Salinas River, and we say this: the Salinas River is beautiful. Most of it's underground. You can't see it. It travels underground, and it fuels basically everything that we eat. The lettuce fields, the strawberries, the snap peas. It's all fueled by the underground river. And that's how I like to think about movement space and what art and culture kind of does. It's that underground river. It's the soul of what we're doing. And some people just don't have access to that. They don't know where to look for the underground river. They haven't been taught how to find it. And so what they're doing is pretending that it exists above river, where there is no fuel. And I think that's, to some of your question, where I've seen the biggest disconnect of where those moments are missing, where the soul is missing of it. Those movements don't last. Those organizations don't last. Those people don't last in their leadership. It really does take a grounding and returning to our ancestral lineages to say, oh, this is why I'm doing this work. And those markers, you're right. That's how I think you're almost giving us a playbook, Jenny, around like, how do I look to find out if a movement is the real deal or if a movement leader's real deal? Are there the songs? Are there the symbols? Are there the stories that ground this? Because if there's not, it's just more marketing fluff.
Yep. This conversation could go on for a long time. I would invite you to offer up anything else you want to add in. And if you see any concrete movements that you think embody this new kind of world building. I was thinking about Milpa Collective, but there are lots of others who live this out. I'd be interested to know where you see it.
I think about if I'm thinking about young organizers, folks who are getting into the justice movement for the long term, for the long haul. I think there's a lack of spiritually, culturally grounded and rooted leaders in this space, folks who are not necessarily here to do the strategy work, to do the budgets, the call out culture, the talking points. What we need is more folks who are able to carry the soul of a community, to be the healers in the back end. I don't mean like in kind of you have to know the prayers or traditions or chants over people, but I think like there's a loving presence that is just desperately needed for someone to sit and listen and be present in the way that my grandma was present to me. And I don't know, in where things are so charged, and the challenge is who's got the biggest Twitter following or who's got their hand on the bullhorn. For me, it really is. I'm looking for those leaders who are able to sit in the discomfort of this world and close their eyes and imagine and invite others to imagine with them what world is possible. And that takes a spiritual rootedness that and training that hopefully folks are finding or looking for. I think of, and that ties me to that second part of that question. Yeah, Milpa is doing that. They're Reimagining. That's a group out of California that's doing indigenous for Black and brown folks who are on the front lines of challenging the mass incarceration system in a very local way, that they're enculturating the next generation of folks. I think of folks like our friend Ashley over at Highlander Center, who are trying to train up a new round of folks to be spiritually grounded rooted. That's what we're trying to do at Auburn Theological Seminary, is how do you find some theological and spiritual grounding rootedness for the work of justice in the world. And that requires a level of discipline and attention that is not, where's the next march at? Where's the next thing? What's the next Twitter thread I can hop on? It's about that quiet time when you're all by yourself, alone with the whatever version of the divine that you believe in, to say, what's the world that I'm trying to help participate in or help manifest in this world. And I just hope more people do that work. It'll make for a much more joyful space. There'll be more singing, more dancing. In my tradition, I need more Miriams, just to be very pragmatic. We know that we have to cross the river. We got Moses and Aaron who are talking up the storm and whatever, telling all these things, but we need more Miriams who are able to dance and sing us into freedom and find that level of groundedness that she had.
You are one who, for me and for many, embodies that kind of loving presence, the carrying the soul of the community, really deep listening, and healing hope. And I just thank you. I'm so grateful.
Same. I'm grateful as well.
And how you are in the world, and for your willingness to share with me some space. Gratitude, love.
Thanks.
Yeah.